Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Shackleton, and I'm with the Ontario Museum Association. I'm glad to welcome you this morning to our webinar, Accessibility Planning for Ontario Museums. As an organization of provincial scope, the Ontario Museum Association recognizes that its members and community live and work on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples. We are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to all communities across the province. We acknowledge that there are more than 40 treaties and other land agreements that cover Ontario, and that the descendants and cultures of the first peoples who lived here are a vibrant and integral part of our society today. We gratefully acknowledge and deeply value the opportunity we have to learn from and cherish the contributions of Indigenous peoples of the past, present, and into the future. As we acknowledge the colonial legacy of museums, we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. As you participate in this gathering, we invite you to reflect on the land that you are on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it is unceded territory. Toronto, where the OMA offices are located, is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Good morning, my name is Christopher Shackleton, and I'm a late 20s male with white skin and dark brown hair, and I'm joining you today from the OMA offices here in Toronto in front of a blue virtual background that includes our OMA logo. I'm so excited to welcome you all this morning to our webinar. So glad that more than 150 of you registered, and we're glad to have you with us this morning, especially on kind of the timeline we had to have it promoted and have everybody join us. So thank you so much for being here. I wanted to make sure everybody knows how to participate today. So you should be able to see the slides and to see and hear the panelists speak. If you'd like to send a question to our panelists, simply type your message into the Q&A box that you can access at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to say hello to your colleagues on the call, you can do so in the chat feature, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And down there at the bottom of your screen, you can also turn on automated closed captions by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. The OMA staff will be monitoring the chat and can help you out with any technical questions that you may have. So today we're going to go through with a series of presenters talking about accessibility planning for Ontario museums. It's an important part as we look forward to welcoming more communities back to our museums that we're able to think about accessibility at all times in parts of that planning. I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Elka Weinstein, who's the museum advisor with the Provincial Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, and the current president of ICOM Canada. Her wide experience of working in heritage museums includes administration, teaching, public interpretation, grant writing, evaluation, exhibition development, and database management. Elka has a master's of museum studies and a PhD in archaeology, and has worked at a variety of cultural institutions across Canada, including the Royal Ontario Museum, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Gardner Museum of Ceramic Art, and various historic sites in Ontario and Quebec. She has also worked with museums in Latin America as a museum education specialist. So good morning, Professor Weinstein, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, hang on. Sorry. Thanks, Christopher, for inviting us to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here for this morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I can only see my screen. So I guess I'll just begin. So I'm going to talk this morning about accessibility for museums in Ontario and planning for the future. The purpose of this webinar is to provide additional context for the ministry's request for an accessibility plan and an overview of the accessibility requirements as set out in the standards for community museums. Okay, so let me just next. The context for this request is that museums must comply with accessibility requirements where they are identified in the standards for community museums in Ontario, or they are referenced or implied in the standards. The ministry requests specific policies and plans with reference to the standards on an annual basis. We hadn't been doing it during the pandemic, but we have started again. And we are hoping that everybody, that this webinar in particular will help everybody to do this. And in the Community Museum Operating Grant, museums will be able to comply with this request, and other museums that are not will benefit from the information that we're going to provide. For 2023, we're requesting an accessibility plan to demonstrate compliance with accessibility requirements. The plans are due from CMOG museums on June 30th, along with the applications. So I just wanted to give everybody a kind of an overview of what we're expecting, because obviously an accessibility policy is different than an accessibility plan. We know that a lot of people in the Community Museum Operating Grant Program in particular, a lot of museums are municipal museums, and they already have accessibility policies, whether from the municipality or their own accessibility policy. So those accessibility policies are usually part of a municipal overall policy. And they commit the municipality and therefore the museum to the principles of accessibility and inclusion for everyone. So those are policies, practices, and procedures concerning the provision of goods and services to people with disabilities, actually, and to everyone. A plan is a little bit different in that it outlines the policies and actions that the museum will put into place to improve opportunities for people with disabilities. And so what we're asking for in this case is we're asking for a plan that talks about how the museum is going to achieve that. What does accessibility mean for museums in the context of the standards for community museums in Ontario? So museums have to make their services and resources available to all potential users. And the definition of a disability that you see on the screen here is the one that we're using. And obviously a disability can be either permanent and or temporary. And my colleague from the Accessibility Directorate, Wendy Bailey, will be speaking more about accessibility and the definitions for it in the Disabilities Act. So here's a quote from a very interesting article that I read. I've been doing a fair amount of research into accessibility over the last, I'd say about 10 years, actually. And so I really like this quote. I'll read it to you. Doing accessibility work is about understanding real and perceived barriers that make visitors feel unwelcome in museums. And for museum practitioners, it's about opening yourself up to learning more about a community different from your own and learning to embrace experiences and meaning across a range of human ability. And so I thought that kind of addressed really the sort of central tenet of what accessibility means for museum practitioners and for people and for welcoming visitors into your museum. So next, I'm going to go over the particular standards that we were hoping that people's plans would address. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about the physical plan and the community standard, but I'm also going to talk about other standards that address accessibility as well, and you can include those in your plan also. So the physical plant and community standards outlined in the standards for community museums in Ontario enable community museums to meet visitors' expectations, be accountable and transparent to the community funders and donors. And then several other of the standards enable community museums to provide appropriate care for collections and meet municipal, provincial, and federal guidelines and legislation. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit as well. So the community standard, make sure that, and I'm just using extracts here from the standards. You'll see if you go to the community standards, to the page where the standards is housed on our website, you'll see that the standards are much more fulsome than this, but I'm just extracting pieces that have to do with accessibility here. So the museum is accessible and relevant and draws support from its community. and it has to endeavor to provide equality of access to information about the museum's collection, services and programs through adequate promotion. And in 2016, when we revised this standard in particular, we added a section which was about equal access in terms of physical and intellectual access to collections through electronic means. So through a website or through social media, or in many cases through webinars and other types of electronic means. So that's the community standard. The physical plant standard, so that's a pretty obvious one. As a community museum, your buildings and grounds must provide a safe and functional environment for visitors, staff, the collection, and associated activities. And for those of you who have heritage houses or heritage buildings, this objective needs to be balanced with the need to preserve the integrity of heritage buildings as artifacts themselves, as well as archaeological resources present on the property. So the physical plant standard does take into account that some buildings may not ever be accessible, and so therefore you have to do your best, essentially. As in this case, let me go back for a second here. For the community standard, for example, I'm going to use the example of the City of Hamilton museums, which are free to access with a library card. So that's one kind of accessibility. But they also, and City of Toronto museums, of course, quickly followed suit with free access to all museums in general and the City of Toronto. But the City of Hamilton Civic Museums has an accessibility statement. And their accessibility statement is about the World Wide Web Consortium Web Accessibility Initiative. And it identifies the overall goal of the standards are to create web content that is perceivable, operable, and understandable by the broadest possible range of users and compatible with their wide range of assistive technologies now and in the future. And this standard has been adopted by the Government of Ontario, of Canada, by the Government of Ontario, and the Hamilton Civics Museum's website generally complies with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, to a 2.0 level. So when you're thinking about doing your website, when you're thinking about trying to give access in terms of electronic access, you need to be thinking about this. And I'm sure lots of you have already thought about this and are endeavoring to get to that point. So for the physical plant standard, I wanted to give an example that I thought was very wonderful and meaningful. And in terms of again, giving people access to, say, the second floor of a heritage house. There's not always a great staircase. There's not always an elevator. Sometimes you can't put in an elevator. But the best example, one of the best examples that I've seen of access is something that was done at Hutchison House in Peterborough. And access to the second floor was achieved through a large print museum plan on paper with illustrations. So they gave people a booklet which had the plan of the main floor and the second floor. And so access was given to people via the plan and the paper, on paper, with the illustrations. It's a very low tech solution. It's a high visibility. The plan was also given as a high visibility sort of thing for people with who had visual disabilities. And I thought it was a great solution and a very easy one to achieve. So there's some other really great examples out there, but that one in particular I thought was fantastic. So I'm going to also talk about accessibility in some of the other standards now. One of these is the human resources standard, where museums have to have a human resources management policy that takes into consideration that all staff members may not have the same ability. So I'm not going to read this out, but I'm going to highlight the second part of the human resources standard section, which says that the human resources management section needs to be consistent with accepted practice and applicable legislation, has to provide equal access to the workplace by staff of all abilities, and has to meet municipal, provincial, and federal legislative requirements relating to people in the workplace. And I think that's a fairly obvious kind of thing. One of the organizations that really foregrounds this kind of standard is a group called Tangled Art and Disability. And they have a museum exhibition center at 401 Richmond in downtown Toronto, but they do advocacy for disabilities in arts and culture province-wide. And I urge you to go to their website and look, if you're in Toronto, to visit their exhibition center and to talk with the staff there, because it's been an enlightening experience for me as well. Okay. Next, we have the governance and exhibition standards. The governance standard talks about meeting municipal, provincial, and federal legislative requirements, and that the museum and its staff must demonstrate a commitment to ethical behavior as an institution and as individuals. A community museum must ensure, in the exhibition standard, a community museum must ensure that exhibits are accessible and capable of being used and enjoyed by visitors of all ages and abilities. And when we're talking about legislation, I also wanted to mention that the Accessible Canada Act, which came into force in 2019, is a new federal act that whose overarching goal is to realize a barrier-free Canada in the entire nation by 2040. The legislation benefits all Canadians, especially persons with disabilities, through the proactive identification, removal, and prevention of barriers. This applies to organizations under federal responsibilities, so government departments, agencies, crown corporations, banks, Parks Canada, and it also applies to national historic sites. So if you're in a building at a site that is a national historic site, this applies to you as well. And the Act requires that organizations prepare and publish accessibility plans to be updated every 3 years. So everybody has to prepare and publish progress reports. So that's a little tweak for those of you who might think, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me. It actually does. So finally, I wanted to talk about the interpretation and education standard. As a community museum, your interpretation and education programs allow the community to interact more closely with your collections and information and reach audiences of all ages, interests, and abilities. And an example here is, I don't know if you all know about this, but the AGO's Art in the Moment tours gives access to people with Alzheimer's and their caregivers in an artful stroll down memory lane. This is it's a collaboration between the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto. And they're hour-long tours for people with dementia and their caregivers, exploring the AGO collection on tours that weave art with interactive conversations. And I've been on a couple of those tours and they are wonderful. If you could achieve something like this at your own site, that would be fantastic as well. So planning for the future. These are some of the criteria for creating your accessibility plan. Does your museum meet the standards in terms of accessibility? If not, how can you improve it? What are the actions that we need to take to improve access? What are the timelines for those improvements, and who is responsible for these improvements? So this is kind of a checklist for those of you writing a plan. to achieve your plan and create a plan. And so further to the checklist, the plan should demonstrate compliance with the standards, in particular with the two key ones, but a more complete plan will mention or reference the other standards, includes actions now in the future to make the museum accessible and compliant in 2 years and in 5 years. And then it identifies who will be responsible for the changes as well. And the deadline for the submission for CMOG grants is June 30th, as always. And if you have any questions at all, please send me an email or call me at the number in this, and I'm happy to answer questions of any kind. And finally, I've got some recommended resources here, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I think we'll be sharing these PowerPoints with everybody. And at least I'll share my PowerPoint with you. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Weinstein. And yes, all the slides today will be shared with everybody along with the recording as soon as it's processed and available. So thank you so much.
Great.
Coming up next, we're going to introduce Wendy Bailey, who is an accessibility policy advisor at the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility. So Wendy has worked tirelessly for over 15 years to advance the government's framework for accessibility. Her experience extends from supporting disability representatives on standards development committees, delivering policy options for the development of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or IASR, and authoring educational tools and resources to support the implementation of the standards. Wendy is an advocate for universal design and a user-centered approach to address barriers that prevent the full participation of people with disabilities. Good morning, Wendy. Thank you so much for joining us, and we can see your slides and you're ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just giving my computer a second to catch up to show me its slides. I'm sorry. It's got a mind of its own this morning. One moment, we are spinning. So anyhow, that was a very interesting presentation by my colleague in MTCS. Thank you very much for hearing that. And again, just give me one moment. Okay, so here we go. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes, we are. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So thank you for inviting me here today to share with you an overview of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and how accessibility standards can help you to achieve a sense of belonging by design. So making Ontario open for everyone. So what is accessibility? First, I'd like to describe what's on my screen, which is the image is of a group of people representing various disabilities. There is a person seated in a power wheelchair, a person leaning on a cane, and a person being supported by a service animal. So accessibility is about giving people of all abilities the opportunity to participate in everyday life. So when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about more than ramps and automatic door openers, which are of course essential, but accessibility is about changing attitudes, like making assumptions about what someone can or cannot do because of their disability. So it's about inclusion, welcoming, and making everyone feel like they belong. So additionally, accessibility is understanding that while people with disabilities may have different needs, all we have to do is ask, how may I help you? So many of the requirements under the AODA are not prescriptive. So accessibility, it's different things for different people. And keeping in mind, a standard sets a minimum requirement. So this means that many of the requirements under the AODA, are not prescriptive. So what this means is that while organizations must comply with the standards, it is up to the individual organization to decide how best to do it. So creative solutions are always encouraged. And dialogue with people with disabilities is imperative to this process. Solutions should meet the principles of accessibility, which my colleague spoke to earlier, but the key principles are independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity. So accessibility, a lot of it is just good common sense and good customer service and communication skills. So for as an example, if a person approaches a service counter and they're having difficulty hearing the person behind the counter, the service provider might first ask the person if it is okay, but then pull out a pad and paper and begin communicating by writing. So it's you know, just being thoughtful and providing what is needed in the moment to that person so they have access. But I want to give you an example of an approach to designing or thinking about independence, dignity, integration, and equality of opportunity with an image on the screen. And this cartoon shows a snowy entrance to a school where a student who is seated in a wheelchair asks the maintenance person if he could shovel the ramp to allow access. And the student is told first, I'm shoveling the stairs for the rest of the kids who are waiting, then I will clear the ramp for you. And the student points out aptly that, but by clearing the path on the ramp means we can all get in. So that's an interesting perspective to think about those key considerations for inclusion. So there's also a pressing business need right now for considering and implementing accessibility, and it's largely due to an aging population. So accessibility features in products and services we know improve experiences for all users, including people with disabilities and now a growing population of older adults. So in 2017, the Canadian Survey on Disability Data indicated to us that 23% of Ontarians between the ages of 45 and 64 have or report having a disability. And what's interesting is that that survey provides us the average age of onset by disability type. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. So for flexibility, dexterity, or mobility, it's 53 years old, 47 for hearing, 45 for pain, 44 for memory, and 35 for vision. Now, where vision is concerned, an onset of a visual disability at 35 years old, it is most often a progressive condition that generally takes about a decade to become a full disability or experienced as a disability. And that puts that person in around the 45 age range, which is right in that sweet spot of 23% of Ontarians acquiring disabilities. Now, I'd like to give you an idea how this plays out in my sector, the Ontario Public Service. They employ approximately 60,000 people, according to our Workforce Analytics first quarter 2022-2023 report. This report said that 67% of OPS employees are between the ages of 40 and 64. So this means that 23% of the 67% is 9,246 Ontario public servants who have just recently acquired accommodation, are acquiring it, or are about to acquire it. So that is something very important to consider, because why is accessibility important? Well, accessibility, it's going to help employers keep talent in the workplace longer. Accessibility, it's going to help retain your most experienced employees and maybe volunteers, and remove barriers for a growing segment of your population, which are older adults. And additionally, younger generations, such as millennials and Generation Z, as we've come to know them, well, they are more educated, diverse, and inclusive than previous generations. These generations now make up a considerable share of the working age population and are driving societal change in both labor and economic markets. So now I would like to give you some legislative context of Ontario's accessibility laws. So in 1962, it at first was the Ontario Human Rights Code. Now, the code is administered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and this is an individual complaints-based legislation that addresses discrimination. It requires organizations to accommodate people with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which was enacted in 2005, is Ontario's most innovative accessibility law and is the province's primary legislative authority for accessibility. It applies to all organizations, which includes public, private, and not-for-profit sectors that provide goods, services, and facilities. So again, the IASR sets a minimum standard. So the Ontario Human Rights Code may require a higher level of accessibility. And you must understand that the Ontario Human Rights Code is quasi-constitutional law. So it is our big kahuna. So under the integrated accessibility standards, there are 5 accessibility standards in place. And I'd like to now give you some of the highlights of those standards. So customer service. So this is about ensuring customers with disabilities can access your service. As an example, you welcome service animals or provide a feedback channel for feedback about your accessibility services, training staff and volunteers, and finding alternative ways that people with disabilities can access your services where barriers may exist. And Elsie gave us a great example of the museum who provided that information on the lower level where they couldn't get to the upper level. And that's exactly what accessible customer service is about. So information and communication is about ensuring that people with disabilities receive information in a format that respects their disability. So where possible, the ideal condition is that we are creating documents that are accessible to assistive technology at source. Many of the information and communication requirements are actually on request. So this means if you are unable to develop accessible documents at source, you will take steps to provide the information in a converted format that considers the requester's specific needs. And this is always done in consultation with the person who's making the request. Sorry, I've gone too far too fast. Backing up, now we have transportation. So transportation is about ensuring people with disabilities receive the same level of service when using public transit, whether it's specialized or conventional. So the intent of the standard is to make conventional transportation as accessible as possible to as many people with disabilities as possible. But where it is not impossible, and that can happen, specialized service requirements, they aim to provide equal service, such as operating during the same business hours as the municipal's conventional service. So employment is about supporting people with disabilities to find jobs and receive supports throughout their employment life cycle. That includes career development and advancement. So this is done through active offers of accommodation in job ads and developing accommodation plans to help employees with disabilities function on a level that is equal to colleagues without disabilities. And then finally, the design of public spaces includes specific features or required outcomes. And we call these performance requirements that make it easier for everybody to use public spaces. So some of these features include sidewalks that are wide enough for people to move around and free of barriers, such as sandwich boards or overhead protrusions, which might be a hanging flower basket. Pedestrian signals at intersections, they use both audible and tactile clues to help people move across the street safely. Accessible playgrounds, they are performance-based requirements, and this is to allow creativity to integrate play. Wider accessible parking spaces are there for people who need to offboard their or onboard mobility devices into their personal vehicles. And service counters requirements support various customer service methods while ensuring that a person seated in a mobility device can use the counter. So additionally, there are general requirements that relate to all the standards. So the requirements that cut across the 5 standards are captured under the general section of the regulation. And so here are some of the highlights. So policies must be developed to support the standards. Public sector and large private organizations are required to establish and maintain multi-year accessibility plans, and these outline the strategies to prevent and remove barriers. Now, the public sector also has to consult with people with disabilities when establishing, reviewing, and updating those plans. Organizations have to train employees and volunteers about the regulation, as well as the Ontario Human Rights Code as they relate to people with disabilities. Training must also be provided to anybody participating in developing an organization's policies and to anyone who provides goods, service, or facilities on your organization's behalf. So if you hire a consultant to deliver a service, you are responsible for ensuring that that consultant has received the training. Additionally, there are requirements for the procurement of self-serve kiosks for procurement and self-serve kiosks, sorry, which are more specific to the public sector organizations. And they have to incorporate accessibility when procuring goods, services, and facilities, and they must include accessibility features in any self-serve kiosk that they design or procure. So there are a couple of new standards currently under development, and they're in the areas of healthcare and education, and their intent is to reduce and prevent barriers in those specific areas. So each of these efforts is intended to bridge any regulatory gaps for accessibility where necessary. So where the initial 5 standards may still have gaps in these areas, these standards are meant to fill in those gaps. So the committees have submitted their final reports to the Minister for Seniors and Accessibility for consideration, and you can read the final recommendations on the government's website right now. The AODA does allow the minister to accept the committee's recommendations in whole, in part, or with modifications. So these standards are not yet regulatory requirements, but they are on their way to potentially being so. So now I want to talk about municipal accessibility advisory committees, because as mentioned earlier, dialogue with people with disabilities is imperative to the process for removing barriers. They know best about them and they've been experiencing them, so they are the best people to consult. So to this end, the AODA requires municipalities with populations of over 10,000 to create an accessibility advisory committee. So the majority of members of that committee must be people with disabilities. Their role is to report to municipal councils and provide them with advice on accessibility plans, accessibility in new buildings or regulations, and accessibility in any site plans. But if your municipality does not have an AAC, any of the not-for-profit organizations in your local areas, such as CNIB or the Canadian Hearing Society, March of Dimes, etc., so they can assist in you locating people with various disabilities who you can engage to seek their advice on barriers and accommodation through their lived experience. So who must comply with the AODA? Because it does include enforcement mechanisms. It actually places the onus on obligated sectors to demonstrate compliance. So it is not a complaints-based statute like the Ontario Human Rights Code. Businesses and other organizations that are covered under the standards, they demonstrate compliance by filing a compliance report at regular intervals. So the reports are filed online. They are a simple checklist format and they use a smart form. So they're quite easy to use. The reporting schedule for large private and not-profit organizations is every 3 years. Designated public sector, they must report every 2 years, and the Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly, they report annually. And our big news is December 31st, 2023 is the next compliance deadline for all sectors. So my ministry will be having a very busy year, particularly in December. Early reporting is always encouraged. So there are a number of free tools and resources to help you in meeting the accessibility standards regulation. So if you visit the government's website at ontario.ca/accessibility, you will find a template that can assist in developing an accessibility plan. You'll also find a self-assessment tool to help you identify the specific AODA requirements that apply to your organization. So I would encourage you to visit the website and explore the tools and resources that are available to help you. And if you have any questions, we are here to help. You can, as mentioned, visit our website. You can get great information there, and often your questions can be answered through those materials. I've included in this slide our contact information. You can call us, follow us on our social media accounts of Twitter and Facebook, or if you have a question, we are happy to answer your question. If you send us an email to accessibility@ontario.ca, we will be more than happy to provide you a fulsome response to your question in writing. And I would like to, in close, wish you all the best of luck in your endeavors and applications for the grant, and I hope you are all successful, and thank you for all that you do to make Ontario accessible.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Wendy. Always great to learn more about what the AODA brings to us, and excited to hear about those new standards coming in, making sure that we're all able to comply with those as they are released.
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, you're so welcome. Coming up next is Alex Glass, the Executive Director at ArtsBuild Ontario. So Alex is the Executive Director at ArtsBuild and is responsible for the organization's overall financial, strategic, and operational leadership. She has been with ArtsBuild for over 8 years and successfully secured funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Ontario Arts Council. Alex has executed grants from all these funders, as well as other projects supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation and the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. Over the years, she has grown ABO's programs and partnerships and contributed to increased revenues. Alex managed the development of the Accessibility Toolkit for Creative Spaces in Ontario and the corresponding 6-part webinar series, the Creative Spaces Case Study Series, and the expansion of Space Finder across Canada and 11 communities. Good morning, Alex. Thank you for joining us, and your screen is up and you're ready to go.
Thanks, Christopher, and hello, everyone. Nice to see some familiar names in the participant list. My name is Alex Glass. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a 34-year-old Caucasian woman with blonde hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. Thank you for all the helpful information from Wendy and Elka earlier. And to build on their presentations, I'm happy to share some resources from ArtsBuild Ontario for other organizations joining us today. ArtsBuild Ontario is a provincial art service organization that provides small and medium-sized organizations with tools, training, and advice to successfully manage physical and digital creative spaces. ABO works to reimagine the future of creative spaces through dedicated research projects and an engaged network of supportive partners. We also operate 44 Gawkel Creative Workspace in partnership with the City of Kitchener. These are some of our programs and resources as well available on our website, including the Learning Series, the Indigenous Creative Spaces Project, our mentoring network, Bricks and Mortar, and Asset Planner for the Arts, if you are interested in checking those out. So topics for today include our accessibility toolkit and webinars, which I'll chat about in a moment, some project examples and resources that you might find helpful, and some funding opportunities for projects that we'll be talking about. So in 2019, ABO undertook an enabling change project to develop a toolkit and webinar series aimed at increasing awareness of the design for public spaces standards under the AODA. To create these resources, we worked closely with an accessibility advisory committee of arts organizations led by Kim Fullerton at Akimbo at the time and Luke Anderson at Stopgap. The toolkit provides links to resources, articles, and examples for creative spaces on the AODA. The toolkit aims to inform arts organizations on how they can go beyond the standards to ensure accessibility and inclusion are at the forefront of building and managing their creative spaces. So the toolkit is broken down into 6 sections, which include an introduction to accessibility. This includes information on legislation and universal design. The next section is creative spaces and accessibility. This section is rich with examples of guides from Tangled and Humber College, which we'll talk about in a moment, Access Visual Arts, and the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, which are, I think, very pertinent for this audience today. Thirdly, we have conversations with artists in creative spaces. This really dives into questions you can ask with your staff, volunteers, or patrons, or artists that you're working with in your organization, as well as communication pathways. Fourth, we have resources for designers and architects. This is also just really good insight for anybody taking on a capital project to kind of understand that lens and how you approach a project to build accessibility in from the ground up. And then we have fire codes and safety policies, not often thought of, but important nonetheless for any emergency situations that you face in your spaces. And then we have funding for accessibility projects as well. And the webinars, if you have time to watch these, I really encourage you to do so. We had some fantastic speakers join us when we did this project. The first one, and hosted by all, called Let's Talk About Disability in Creative Spaces. Thea Curdy, who's currently on our board of directors after this project. She's president of Designable Environments. So she hosted this entire series with us. And she did the first one with Sage Level from Deaf Spectrum. We also had speakers from the ROM, including Dave Hollins, Laurie Carzier from Accessibility and Wellness at Human Space. We had as well, oh my gosh, Amy Potier from Gensler, Corey Timpson, who's the former Vice President of Exhibitions at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'll talk about some of their examples as well. We had Martin Day from Safety Media Inc. and Marnie Peters, who's an accessibility specialist. And we also had Alex Bulmer and Andrew Gurza, both disability awareness consultants. It was just a fantastic series and really encourage everyone to check it out. So I'm going to do some project examples to talk about what some capital creative space projects that incorporate accessibility look like. And Kevin Pudister, who's the general manager at the Dundas Museum and Archives, is on this webinar today. So Kevin, feel free to chime in on the chat and add to anything or correct anything that I'm just about to go through for the Dundas Museum and Archives. Okay, so let's look at an independent nonprofit arts organization first. So in 2012, the Dundas Museum and Archives undertook a renovation project with accessibility as a major central component of this project. The addition, they added a ramp on the side of the entrance and an elevator as well that was newly installed to ensure a barrier-free entrance and the ability for the public to move through the facility freely. The washrooms are made accessible in this project and doors were widened. And the elevator that you see here on the right side of the screen, there's two pictures actually. One that shows the ramp on the outside of the Dundas Museum and Archives building, and the other shows their newly installed elevator to the right. This elevator goes down to the basement of the building to ensure it's accessible for staff and volunteers to go downstairs and anybody going to that part of the building. And the staff and volunteers have received accessibility training to ensure they are equipped to accommodate accessibility requests and ensure visitors feel comfortable in the building. Secondly, I wanted to talk about the project from ID Exchange with the old post office as a municipal example. Of course, independent nonprofits and municipalities have different resources and different approaches to their operations, so I thought I'd share one of each. In the case of ID Exchange in Cambridge, they integrated accessibility into the renovation and expansion of the old post office building on the Grand River. For those of you who live near here, I really recommend visiting. It's a fantastic space. From 2014 to 2018, ID Exchange undertook a $15.3 million project, which was mostly funded by their municipality. Accessibility was a key consideration as well and addressed throughout the project. Before construction began, the designs were approved by the City of Cambridge's Accessibility and Diversity Services Committee. And once the building was open, they actually had the committee walk through it and make sure that all of the improvements that were recommended were up to par. The City of Cambridge referenced their municipal facility accessibility design standards when renovating the old post office, as well as their other ID Exchange locations. This document outlines the citywide standards that build a universally designed and accessible community for residents, visitors, and employees. Other accessibility features in ID Exchange's old post office location include accessible collections, which have large print books, audiobooks, ebooks, dementia-friendly books, memory kits, and light therapy lamps. And they also have magnifying glass and assistive listening devices and reader pens available upon request. I also wanted to take a look at some accessibility features in some of our creative spaces, in addition to capital projects. And these particular examples came up time and time again from our advisory committee and topic experts that we engaged in the Enabling Change project we undertook. So guidelines for exhibits. I would love to point everyone towards this toolkit created by Humber College and Tangled Arts, as well as all of Tangled Arts resources in general. They are fantastic. This toolkit provides recommendations and guidelines for accessible exhibits, including artwork display, interactive installations, multisensory presentations, and additional information for gatherings, events, and communications. So I have included all the links to these resources at the end of my presentation, so you'll see a link to this toolkit here. So highly recommend giving it a look through. I also want to share a few accessibility features from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. The first one being universal access points. These are small tactile squares that have raised numbers in Braille, not dissimilar to a traditional audio guide sticker. They can be accompanied by a small tactile floor strip for cane detection, so someone with low vision or blindness can actually detect where the universal access point is. Secondly, universal keypads. The Canadian Museum of Human Rights uses touchscreen kiosks in most of their galleries, which have universal keypads for visitors with low vision or restricted mobility. These large tactile keypads use simple symbols and audio instructions to help visitors navigate through the kiosks and discover exhibit content through audio tracks. Thirdly, a mobile app. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights has a mobile app which integrates locations of their universal access points. The app contains fully accessible self-guided tours and an interactive map. The tours are available in ASL, LSQ, and both French and English with audio descriptions. And lastly, I just want to mention quiet spaces. These are nice, calm rooms to have available in your museums and just simple to set aside and designate those spaces. I just wanted to use the ROM has multiple quiet spaces on 4 of their exhibit floors. And lastly, talk about funding opportunities. How can we, how can arts organizations pay for and fund these accessibility features and projects in their spaces? So firstly, we'll talk about the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund offered through the Department of Canadian Heritage. It's a matching fund. It can support up to 50% of your projects sometimes up to 75% of it, depending on the nature of your project. There is a rolling deadline. Municipalities and nonprofits can both apply. And eligible projects include new builds, renovations, and purchase of specialized equipment. So some of the features that we saw today would be eligible. There's also the Enabling Accessibility Fund offered through Employment and Social Development Canada and provides funding for projects that make communities and workplaces more accessible for people with disabilities. Municipalities and nonprofits are both eligible. The small project deadline is likely in early November 2023. They kind of give you a little bit short notice as these things go. So having a project in mind is really key. And the small project component, there are two, there's a small and a medium sized. The small project component can fund up to $100,000 of your project. You need 20% of your cash contributions confirmed. And then the mid-sized project component, this last closed in 2021. It's unknown when the next intake period will be, but this fund supports $350,000 from $350,000 to $1 million of your project and requires 35% of cash contributions to be confirmed. And then lastly, I'll make mention of the Ontario Trillium Foundation's capital stream. This fund supports equipment purchases, new builds, renovations, retrofits, and repairs. You must be a nonprofit to apply. And OTF will support projects from $10,000 to $150,000. And the deadline is coming up for this year in June 14th. So you have time to apply. It's not a matching fund. So depending on the nature of your project, you could get it fully funded. And that's my contact information. So if you have any questions about our toolkit or our webinars or any of the resources that we mentioned today, feel free to reach out. And here's the link to all my resources. Okay, Christopher, back to you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And a reminder to everybody that we will be providing everybody's slides with the recording. So all of those great links and things will be available to all of us in just a couple of days. So upcoming next is Michael Rikley-Lancaster, who's Executive Director Curator at the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum. And he's been there since July 1st of 2007. He studied fine arts at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, before receiving a diploma in applied museum studies from Algonquin College in Ottawa. He was employed as assistant curator at the Diefenbunker, Canada's Cold War Museum, and then a program coordinator for Young Canada Works in heritage organizations with the Canadian Museums Association. He has served on the Council of Heritage Organizations Ottawa, as well as the Lanark County Tourism Association Board of Directors and the Municipality of Mississippi Mills Downtown Almont Heritage District Study Committee and the Community Heritage Ontario Board of Directors. He currently sits on the Heritage Advisory Committee and the Riverwalk Working Group for the Municipality of Mississippi Mills and is part of the Lanark County Museum Network. Michael also sits on the Ontario Historical Society's Museum Advisory Committee, and he was the 2014 Cultural Achievement Award winner for the Young Award within the Municipality of Mississippi Mills. He's also our current secretary of the OMA Council. Good morning, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. Your slides are up and you're ready to go.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Michael Rikley-Lancaster. My pronouns are he, him. I am a Caucasian cis male in my 40s. I'm wearing, I'm balding and I have gray hair. And I'm wearing a gingham button-up shirt, blue. I have a non-visible disability as well. And I look forward to walking you through what our museum has done over a fairly lengthy period of time with regard to accessibility and touching on our plan as well. And looking at real and perceived barriers, as Elka had mentioned. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So first I want to also, it's my honor to note that the sacred land on which the museum sits in the municipality of Mississippi Mills is now located, has been a site of human activity for over 10,000 years and is rich in Indigenous history. This land is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. We are grateful to the Algonquin ancestors who cared for this land, water, and air in order that we might meet here today. So basically, I started working at the museum here in 2007. And in that time, we had a building needs assessment. My predecessor had worked to get grant funding to do a 2005 building needs assessment. document that was prepared by the Commonwealth Historic Resource Management of Perth. Then we took that plan and made kind of using that guide of the building needs assessment, we created a 5-year plan at the time for restoration renovation, and within that was accessibility. We ended up extending it to more of a 10-year plan as we moved forward. So I'm going to just start walking through some of the projects that we did, which we feel fits into the accessibility aspect. A lot of things weren't in the museum. So in some ways, I mean, the museum was operating before I got here, but a lot of things were done that really we didn't have a lot of aspects to the museum, including lighting and drywall and a few things like that. So in 2008, we got some funds to do some installation of drywall, track lighting, and insulation in our second floor museum space. And the way that funding was divided out is we had received 15,000 from Trillium Foundation, 36,000 from Parks Canada National Historic Site Cost Sharing Program, and then 18,500 from community donations. Then in 2011, we embarked on adding an accessible ramp, as you can see in the image there, as well as new accessible washroom on the first floor and an upgrade to our second floor washroom facility to make it accessible, including paving our parking and adding 10 spots at the back and making it also then an accessible parking, etc. for those space. And we received 32,690 from Enabling Access Fund, and then 8,500 from community donor, the Dolgoy family, and that was in 2013, a follow-up, and that was adding exterior lighting, which we didn't have on our facility. Okay, then continuing on with this, we then received 62,400 in 2014 from OTF, and then 73,029 from the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund to then put in an elevator shaft, and then also add push buttons for doorways leading to and from the elevator for exterior doors and interior doors. And we then actually recently got funds through COVID relief funding and have changed all those push buttons to motion sensor buttons to get you through to that elevator and back. So we also, and this is where thinking about other ways of accessibility, not just physical accessibility, we also had received in the past in 2009, 18,000 from the Museum Assistance Program to take some of our collection online, as well as our Almont Gazette online in a searchable format. And so, yeah, I've already touched on this one. So again, in 2013, the Almont Gazette, we were blessed to have our local library already had the Gazette scanned on hard drives. So then we took it and put it through digital recognition software and then launched it onto our website. That sounds very simple, but it was a big project and a lot of work, but has seen a lot of positive national, international, and local engagement through that. And funds were secured also from Museum Technology Fund of 40,733, and then from one of our local foundations and donors. Then we also kind of, we're looking at other ways now of accessibility. And I feel accessibility is something we're always going to be working at, and we're going to be learning new things and growing and just being open and receptive to those new things and learning and growing as humans and making our spaces as safe as possible for as many people as possible. So one of the other things we've been doing, and it kind of started during lockdowns, was we've added a few things. We redid our upstairs, our second floor history exhibition, making it fully bilingual, French, English. And then also we've added closed captioning to all of our videos. And then we also had added at the time foot pedals for the videos to start and stop. And we've made them so that you can wheel onto them as well for accessibility. And then we also have engaged, we're working towards, and we are engaging with our marginalized communities. First off with our Indigenous community. And again, it reiterates some of the things that have been talked about. We're working with them, and we're working with them to take the lead on their narrative. So we're working with 2SLGBTI+, youth, Indigenous, Black people, people of color, immigrants, and differently abled folks or disabled. And we also, during lockdowns, went through all this process of training with all our volunteers and staff on diversity and inclusion, and we ended up applying for the Rainbow Registered through the Canadian Chamber of Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And we were the first Rainbow Registered kind of museum gallery in Canada to have that registration. Again, looking at what's next, there's always going to be more, and working more and more with the diverse groups in our community and outside of our community to foster new partnerships and relationships. Focus on bringing more inclusive representation to the museum's exhibits and within the organization. Outreach to youth, 2SLGBTI+, Indigenous, Black, people of color, immigrants, and differently abled folks. Update our foot pedals. We're now updating them because they didn't last very long. We just kind of did an in-house making of those foot pedals for the televisions, changing those to motion sensor videos. Incorporate accessibility features into our new exhibitions. We just received Museum Assistance Program funding to now redesign our museum's website to include accessibility tools. And again, we're learning so much as we go, learning from others, professionals out there, but also reaching out to those diverse groups and disabled people, and to learn what are the best tools to use on our website that can make it work best for them and for everyone in our communities. And please reach out. My email is there. Please reach out anytime. I would love to connect.
Thank you so much, Michael. Always great to hear about all the great things that are happening out in Mississippi Mills, and happy Museum Month. I think the town has proclaimed it, so thank you. Up next is Laurie Webb, the manager of museums, galleries, and archives for the County of Lambton. So she oversees the Lambton Heritage Museum, the Oil Museum of Canada National Historic Site, Lambton County Archives, and the Judith and Norman Alex Art Gallery. She has a degree in history from Western University and a postgraduate certificate in museum management and curatorship from Sir Sanford Fleming College. She was previously the curator supervisor for Lambton Heritage Museum and the Oil Museum of Canada, archivist at Lambton County Archives, director curator at the Museum on Tower Hill, and education program staff member at London Regional Children's Museum. And she was recently appointed to the staff as the staff chairperson for the County of Lambton's Accessibility Advisory Committee. So all of her experience is coming right into play here. So Laurie, I'll let you share your screen if you have any slides, and we'll let you take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Christopher. All right, can you see my screen there?
Everything is up. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me today, Christopher. So as a municipal museum, we have access to a varying number of supports to help us further our accessibility goals. And we've really been focusing on accessibility through a number of renovation projects we've been working on since about 2013. So tapping into some of those resources that the county has available to us, the county has a well-developed accessibility plan and a multitude of policies and procedures which support the AODA Act. And they cover items including things like employment standards, customer service, ongoing training, and general expectations of what the county facilities should be providing to the public. All new employees are onboarded and trained in AODA accessibility, particularly the customer service accessibility. And that onboarding includes a quiz that everybody has to do, and you have to pass it prior to your start date in your new position. As part of the AODA plan, the county has an advisory committee. This committee is made up of members of the public who all have a variety of mobility and/or accessibility concerns. Some members use assistive devices such as wheelchairs and walkers. Some have no mobility issues, but have other disabilities such as low vision or hearing impairments. The committee also has a representative from council who serves as its chair, and then also has a staff liaison who chairs the staff working group to ensure that compliance happens throughout the county. This committee of municipal residents audit different municipal facilities. Approximately, they try to do between 3 and 5 facilities each year. And they visit each location and review how accessible they are for those people using assistive devices and for customer service purposes. And then they make recommendations for improvements. And for us, those audits began in 2013. The committee uses a checklist such as this as they move around the facility and note areas where deficiencies, where they've found deficiencies. And then they make recommendations to make changes to the facility to meet the requirements under the Act and to make our facilities more accessible. The staff working group at the same time also conducts focus meetings with the staff at that facility to identify barriers that the staff are seeing as well and deficiencies and come up with possible solutions. So this is an example of the outcome from the staff working group at Lambton Heritage Museum in 2019. As I mentioned, our first audit was in 2013, and then it was updated in again in 2019. So both the Heritage Museum and the Oil Museum of Canada have had 2 audits in the last 10 years. After the facilities are audited, those checklists come to me as a supervisor, and I then take all that information and create a spreadsheet and assign the work that needs to be done to different staff members and create deadlines and timelines associated with the projects that are going to take place. And then as items are completed, I update the spreadsheet, note when they've been completed, or add in new items as well for subsequent that come out of subsequent audits. Both Lambton Heritage Museum and the Oil Museum of Canada in our first audits had quite extensive lists of items that needed to be addressed. This helped us to prioritize renovations and updates that we wanted to have at the facilities. At that time, planning began for significant renovations, but immediately we started looking at the low-hanging fruit items that we could tackle. So things like painting trip hazards with yellow stripes so that people will see that there's a change in the walkway that they're walking on, or moving admission signs that were hanging above the reception desks down to a lower location. We did things like updating the contrast and the font that we're using in our exhibit text and started working on those simple things right away. And then as a result of a direct result of the audits, we started looking at what are the major projects we wanted to tackle. At Lambton Heritage Museum, one of the things that was identified was a lack of adequate barrier-free washrooms. We did have washrooms that technically you could get a wheelchair or mobility device into, but they weren't great. They didn't function well. And there were still some pretty significant barriers in there. So as a result of the audit, we were able to ask for funding from council to convert 2 of our older washrooms into one fully accessible washroom with an adult change table and 1 gender neutral individual washroom. So you can see here kind of the before and after pictures of what we were working with, and it's really helped to increase our accessibility to the community at large. We've been planning for more extensive and more expensive renovation projects along the way as well. And we try to incorporate accessibility changes into any renovation project that we're doing. So for an example here, you can see the front desk at the Oil Museum of Canada. When we were planning a renovation project there, we purposely looked at the accessibility of the front desk. So we reduced the visual clutter that you would see when you came into the space. We've increased the lighting in the space, and we've made an accessible height counter as well. So you can see just in the after picture, just on the right is the accessible height desk. And then you'll see that there's not nearly as much visual clutter in the space either when you come into the facility. Similarly, at Lambton Heritage Museum, we undertook a large renovation project there of our collection center, and we decided that we were going to extend that renovation slightly into the main into the main entryway as well. And we replaced the admissions desk there. So you'll see that we also reduced clutter, added additional lighting, and then updated the desk to include an accessible height service point. One thing that was identified in the accessibility review in 2019 after we had this desk installed was that the debit terminal couldn't reach to the accessible desk. So we ended up switching our terminal out for a wireless one so that it could reach to the accessible desk as well. So even though we made the change to the desk, the committee still was able to identify a barrier that we were able to easily address and fix. We also use the audit results to help bolster funding requests, whether we're making requests to council or whether it's to external granting agencies. At both Lambton Heritage Museum and the Oil Museum of Canada, the main focus of our major renovation projects that we've been undertaking in the last several years was to upgrade the aging building systems and our exhibits. But we made sure that we were incorporating the removal of any identified accessibility barriers into these projects. So we included things such as looking at our didactics and the font size and the color and making sure the contrast was appropriate. We ensured we incorporated standard heights for text and for spacing of font. We ensured that all of our new spaces are uncluttered and have a minimum of 4 feet around them for mobility devices. And we've updated all the lighting to avoid dark and dim areas. In the upper left-hand corner there, you can see at the Oil Museum of Canada, we've included a touchscreen and we've ensured that there's the ability to roll a wheelchair underneath it so that you can pull straight up to it. The photos on the right show Lambton Heritage Museum's accessible parking area before a laneway replacement project. So the top photo shows the accessible parking spaces, which were actually essentially on the grass. So in the bottom right shows the new accessible parking spaces that were incorporated. And then the photo on the left shows the renovation project we're currently starting to finish up now is the exhibit at Lambton Heritage Museum. And you can see there one of our interpretive panels. We mocked it up and hung it and then quickly realized that the design that we were working with when we were doing our SketchUp modeling didn't translate well into the space for accessible reasons. So we've reworked them so that the main content is much lower and within a set range, and then moved the larger, more graphic images up to the top of the panels. Another thing that we do as a municipal facility is we work with other departments to help make sure we're getting good value for the funding dollars that we're working with. So we've worked with the roads department to include our parking and laneway paving in their tender projects so that we're getting, we can take advantage of the bulk pricing that they're getting for all of the asphalt work that they're having done throughout the county. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner there, the Oil Museum of Canada, we addressed some identified issues with the accessible parking, which was to the left of the building there on the asphalt. There was no straight and easy way to get from the accessible parking to the front door. So we redid some of those walkways as well and included tactile strips in our renovation project for the entranceways to the Oil Museum as well. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see some ramps that cement ramps that were installed to go into our display barns. We worked with our procurement department to help come up with a solution for the step up that was into the building. Previously, it was a wooden ramp that went in that was movable and it didn't meet the right slope. And it was identified in the audit as actually almost a danger to the people that are using wheelchairs. So the procurement department was able to help us with that project. And then we also apply for grant funding as well. So as a result of our audit, identifying the entrances to our historic buildings at both the Oil Museum and the Lambton Heritage Museum as issues, we applied to funding for the Enabling Accessibility Fund to replace the ramps at 3 of our historic buildings. Each ramp was over 20 years old and didn't meet current accessibility guidelines. There was no railings on most of them. They had lack of adequate turning radiuses, and there was actually a lip at the top of the ramp into the threshold, over the threshold into the buildings. So work on those projects has just started last week. So we have, so you can see a couple of progress pictures there of the new ramps being installed in those buildings. So for us, it has been an ongoing project. Did you lose my screen there, Christopher?
We did,
Okay.
but it's back
Sorry.
now. We can see you can see your new ramp projects.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it's for us, incorporating accessibility has been a really big part of our renovation projects, and the audits that our accessibility committee has done has really driven those. So working with the disabled community and with the accessibility committee to determine what needed to change has really helped us to drive our changes and really helped to bolster our rationale for why we needed to do some of the changes that we were looking at across the facilities.
Thank you so much for joining us, Laurie. It's always great to hear about sort of iterative and prototyping stages of managing for accessibility, and certainly including that community collaboration and hearing from your advisory committee. That's really great to hear that those audits have been useful and helped build the accessibility of your spaces. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar now, so I'll invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras back on and we'll get ready to go. We've got a little bit of time here to go through some of the questions, so I invite you all here on the webinar to submit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get through as many as we can, and if there are ones that are kind of outstanding and need more response, we'll try to work with our presenters to make sure you have the information that you need following the webinar. So the first question I will pass to Professor Weinstein, which is, if our museum is on municipal property, but not municipally run, should we be referencing the municipal accessibility plans within our own for things like entrances to the building and washrooms, et cetera? I'm assuming this is about CMOG, so I just wanted to make sure that I went to you first as the expert in the CMOG grant program.
Sure, happy to answer that question. The answer is yes and no. We are expecting all museums in the CMOG program to submit their own plan. But if there's parts of your municipal plan, your municipal accessibility plan that are relevant, then include them because they're useful. So yeah, happy to talk about it further, but I think that's the short answer.
And then I'm curious for Michael, as an independent sort of museum there, did you find that the municipality had accessibility resources that helped you even though you weren't a municipal site? Or were you kind of the vanguards there out in Mississippi Mills, bringing that first accessibility to the forefront?
Yeah, there was support there because they do have an accessibility advisory committee. So we certainly did have resources and support there. So, yeah.
Excellent. Glad to hear that those committees and all those policies and things that people have on their websites are useful to others as well. We had a question for Laurie Webb. Can you remind us who did your accessibility audits and who that committee was comprised of? I think it was a little bit, maybe people just missed it in the webinar. Sure,
yeah. So we, as a municipality, have an accessibility advisory committee, and it's made up of members of the public who have a disability, and then also a member of council sits on the committee, and then myself as the staff liaison. I was just last month appointed as the chair of that staff liaison to be the staff liaison to that committee. So the bulk of the committee is community members that come out and do the audits with the staff.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question, I will go first to Professor Weinstein just for that on CMOG, and then maybe we'll pass around the table as well and hear how everybody else thinks about it. So what timeframes are recommended for organizations that are writing their multi-year accessibility plans? What would you suggest and what has seemed to work?
Well, I guess the answer to that is that, you know, you probably have already been doing some work on your accessibility plan, whether you know it or not. So, you know, if you've been looking at stuff like that for the last 5 years, then, you know, it's 5 years. The time period for for the actual accessibility plan that you put in your plan is, so you're going to do a certain amount of stuff in the next 2 years, you're going to do a certain amount of stuff in the next 3 years, and then you're going to do a certain amount of stuff in the next 5 years. And so then, and it's an iterative plan. So you're kind of going along and progressing over time, and, you know, doing what you can over the 5-year period. So I hope that answers that question. And yeah, there you go.
So I might pass that one next to Michael, because I know Michael's accessibility plan has been the example shared by the OMA as one that people can look to as an example to get their own plan started. So Michael, when you were looking at developing that plan, how are you thinking about the timelines and kind of durations and how long and kind of what your kind of benchmarks were and milestones for completing that?
Basically, because we had that building needs assessment that was done before we even had an accessibility plan in place, we were following that and trying to be ahead of, because just ourselves, we wanted to have our facility accessible for our volunteers, for our staff and community, so they could see the whole facility of the public spaces. And so what we see now with our plan is again, it's just keeping current of what's happening, looking at what the next steps are that we can take to become even more accessible, and looking at our community's needs. And so we don't, and we review the plan every 3 years and update it thereon. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to pass along to Alex next. So in terms of timelines, what have you seen from other organizations around kind of writing grants and getting grants, and what can people kind of expect for how far they in advance they have to plan, they submit the grant, they get it and complete the project? What does that look like for a couple of other organizations?
Sure thing. Well, it depends on the funder and how much notice you have for a grant when it comes out. So I think I mentioned enabling accessibility has notoriously for us. I always have a notification on my calendar every year to look for it at a certain time of year, so we can let our network know about it. So, like any project grant, having that accessibility plan is going to be very helpful for your case to move a recommendation forward for an improvement in your building. So definitely you want to attach that as part of your demonstration of the need. And then in terms of timing, again, it depends on that funder. So with Heritage, with the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, generally depends on the amount that you're asking for. If it's way smaller in scale, they can generally move it a little bit faster because they don't need a more formal approval process. If it's a large project, that will take time to develop the application, and then you can expect to report back on that project within the year. So it's a budget cycle. But also lots of things happen in projects, so you can always apply for those extensions as you need to with your program officer. Generally, they're very understanding of all the things and contingencies that you want to have in place and so forth. So they're generally very supportive. But yeah, just having that idea in your mind, I would say, for any leader planning, and then keeping your eye out for those funding deadlines. It just depends. And they'll let you know as well, usually on the application, when you're going to get a notification of results too.
And I might then pass it along to Wendy, thinking about in terms of the regulations and legislation. Can you remind us of some of those hard dates, kind of the when we expect in advance to have things required to be accessible? Are there any timelines required by AODA for people, kind of years, 2025 or 2035 or any of those dates?
This is interesting. This is where a lot of people get confused, and I'm so happy to clarify for you. The AODA acts on basically a go forward. There is one requirement that goes into that retrofit territory that you must do this, and that was by 2021 for websites. So large organizations who have websites, and large is 50 plus, so they have a little bit of capital to do that. And they were also told in 2011 that this was the date for compliance, so they had 11 years to do it, or 10 years to do it. So accessibility needs to be something that you think of for anytime you're planning a program, you're planning to build something, you're planning to renovate. That's when we want you to incorporate accessibility, because that's the most cost-effective time to do it. There was not a lot of appetite to make you do something by a certain time. But what we want you to do is consult with what's needed in your community. This is why you're consulting with your AACs where you can. And I'm loving hearing that the audits are actually setting up your guideposts on how you do it, because you're doing it right. That was the intent of the standard. And as far as we are not asking you to do something that might be costly that you're not planning on doing yet. So like if you do need an accessible washroom or some changes to the washroom to make it more accessible, the next time that you are planning a renovation, we're not going to force you to renovate for that accessibility, because that would not work for so many people from a policy perspective. So plan as you go and include people with disabilities in everything you plan to do, and you will design something more accessible. So that's really the whole concept, and in a nutshell, that's how we roll.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Wendy. I think I have time for one last question. It's a specific one for Professor Weinstein about CMOG. So we have the question, is there a specific structure or format to the accessibility plan document that needs to be submitted for CMOG?
Well, if you didn't get the email, email me. So no, there isn't a template, but we did say 5 pages maximum. And we also said you should be planning for 2 to 5 years. So that was really all the instructions that we gave.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're at the end of time. So I will thank you all again, and everybody will receive slides and recordings as soon as we get a chance to process them. If there were specific questions submitted, that some people left their names, and we can hopefully connect you to the correct presenter to direct you about that, to make sure we're able to follow up and keep that conversation going. I will say that the OMA website is a source of resources for accessibility plans, including Michael Rikley-Lancaster's now identified as an exemplary plan for a museum there. So you'll hopefully take a look at that, and hopefully it gives you the information you need to continue. I'd like to thank the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport and the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility for approving this as a presentation and for offering us their staff to help present to us today. And thank you to Laurie and Michael and Alex for making time in their busy schedules to join us and sharing all the information and knowledge that they have through their experiences in building accessibility for Ontario's museums. So again, the recording will be sent by email coming up in a few days. If you're thinking about online accessibility, we actually offered a webinar back a few weeks ago about actionable online accessibility with a couple of presenters, including ones from our colleagues at Tangled, Art and Disability. So we'll include links to that in the recording email as well. When you leave the webinar, you'll receive a survey that helps us structure future PD opportunities. So let us know how we did today and what we can do to improve in the future, and the topics that you might like to hear more about. And I'd like to wish everybody on the call today a happy May is Museum Month. We're excited to share all the activities that are happening across the province and some kind of municipal proclamations and announcements from a variety of people. So look for that in your email on Monday and across our social media throughout the entire month of May. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and see you all very soon, and best of luck. And we'll hope to see your accessibility plans very soon. So long, everyone.